Well, hi everybody. Welcome to this session. My name's Tony Smith. I'll be the moderator today for what promises to be a very interesting and I hope a very entertaining session. We're going to take a look today into the crystal ball and look ahead at the next 12 months and perhaps a little bit further to discuss some themes, issues and technologies that have the potential to make a large impact on the internet in 2022 and beyond. This session is called Questions for 2022. And it's an important distinction. We're not going to have definitive answers here today. This session is going to highlight what's some of the things that are on the horizon, hopefully spark questions in your mind for how these trends and concepts may impact you and your organization. And we've got a great panel here to do that today. So let me introduce your speakers. First up, we are joined by the impossibly well-credentialed Professor Hiroshi Asaki from the University of Tokyo. Asaki-san is much more than that. He's also a director of the WIDE project. He's vice chair of JP-NIC, chief architect of Digital Agency Japan, executive director of Japan's IPv6 Promotion Council, director of the Japan Data Center Council and Green University of Tokyo project, and the list goes on. Given how busy he is, we are very lucky to have found an hour in his time, his diary today, and we're really pleased to have him with us. Our second panelist, if you read The Economist or listen to the Babbage podcast, you'll be very familiar with him. And let me just say, if you don't read The Economist or listen to the Babbage podcast, you really should. Ken Cukier is a deputy executive editor of The Economist. He's also the author of best-selling books on big data and AI. He's also a board director of Chatham House, an associate fellow at Oxford's Said Business School, and he's no stranger to our region because he spent time here as a technology editor of the Wall Street Journal Asia. Ken talks to the who's who of the internet industry, and we are really thrilled to have him joining here today, direct from London, nice and early. Thank you very much, Ken. And last but not least is APNIC's own chief scientist, Jeff Houston, who I'm sure most of you on this call know, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Jeff is very well known for his research around internet technologies, and when he's not in the lab, you'll find him speaking at conferences around the world or chairing working groups at the IETF. Jeff helped build the internet in Australia in the 1980s and spent many years at Telstra helping build their network as well. Jeff's a member of the Internet Hall of Fame, and he was awarded an Order of Australia for his pioneering work. So we have a very distinguished panel here, enough credentials here to, I think, to equal the size of the Bitcoin blockchain. But just a quick note before we get underway. We will open this discussion up to all of you watching a little bit later on as we go through the session. But so if you have questions, please note them down and be ready to ask them when the time comes. And I'll give you more information on how to do that shortly. But let's get the discussion started here first, though, before we open it up. And as the least credentialed person here, I'll stop talking and start opening it up to our professional panel. So first up, let's start with Web3. It seems to be the topic peaking in the hype cycle right now. and so it makes sense to start here. But why is everybody talking about it? Now, Ken, I actually may start with you here because you recently hosted a podcast on this very topic. So look, what is Web3 and why should we care?
So it's so funny, Tony. Thank you so much for putting the panel together. And I'm really honored to be on it. I should say I've got basically several heuristics in life that guide me in everything I need to do. And one of them is when Jeff Houston asks you to do something, you do it. And so I saw you as the proxy for Jeff, sort of the liège that brought me here to knowing that I had no other obligation but to get up early and speak to the Apricot community. And in your email, when you asked if I knew Apricot, I thought to myself, does this man not know? I was present at the creation, watching all of the people, your forebears, working and building this incredible institution. I'm so honored now to be here. The second thing I realized is that, you know what, I bet Tony's gonna ask me what Web3 is and try to define it. And he's gonna ask it to me first. And then I said, nah, he would never do that. And the why that struck fear in me is because we spent about a 45-minute podcast coming to the conclusion that it was really hard to understand what the definition of Web3 is. Let me try to put something out there and then we can all talk about it. So Web3 is the term, well, let's start with Web 1 and Web 2. Web 1 is the consumer internet in which, or the academic internet that Saki-san and Jeff built. And it was basically having machines talk to machines. Web 2, if you will, started around 2000 when we realized that user-generated content was going to be the motor of it. And it was the era of social networking. And then to a lesser extent, or later, if you will, I should say, not a lesser extent, later, was mobile phones, which also changed how people interacted with the internet. But at its core, it was that you had this social networking capability with all the network effects and all the data effects, where data was in a flywheel was fed back into it. And that sort of changed the nature of the internet from that first version in which it was just computers and people accessing information in a quasi peer-to-peer way. Technically, the designs was a peer-to-peer design, but pretty quickly by the late 90s, and Jeff remembers this very well, running a telco from its operation standpoint, it was very much a server center and as a hub and spoke network. Okay, so it wasn't the web as was designed by Paul Barron and later Vint and Bob and all that. Okay, so Web 3 is to take the underpinning, the infrastructure of how the internet works and to put it onto the blockchain. And why you would do that is that you would then be able to have a decentralized governance structure and set rules around it. And those rules might be according to the people who have this vision. Things like the data that the social networking company is able to harness is actually not weaponized for an ad network, but is kept secure, or maybe does go into an ad network system, but the users themselves who contribute to the social network get income back, economic return back from it. And you can now think of lots of different designs and how you would reimagine what an Instagram or a Twitter would look like if it was put onto a blockchain with a cryptographic layer that had governance structures to it, governance that was run by the community rather than by one central entity that you were only simply a serf relative to. That's the vision of it. Now we could talk about, is that realizable in a time frame? And would we really lose a gatekeeper, or would we simply shift and change the gatekeeper? But that, in a sense, Web3 is this vision of a decentralized infrastructure for the governance of services on top of the internet.
Fantastic, and no, I think that's a really good description of it. You handled it very well. And but in terms of the, I mean, I've read a lot of, I guess, some skepticism around that, as you mentioned. I mean, is this really going to be the future of everything built on a blockchain? And I know Tim O'Reilly is one of those skeptics. I think Scott Galloway is also another one of the high-profile skeptics of this. I mean, Jeff, what are your thoughts on this concept? And look, do you see this, changing the internet, impacting the internet this year, or is this something you think is a far off concept?
No, snake oil springs to mind. There is no wisdom in crowds, and quite frankly, disintermediation of intermediaries causes chaos. Underneath this is actually an attempt of a shift of value, and it's an attempt to unseat the existing incumbents and move power and money somewhere else. The whole issue is, though, that the banking system in particular with blockchain is proving remarkably resilient to having the tables turned on them. And the web, I'm sorry, you're dealing with the 10 most valuable companies on this planet whose major job is to resist all attempts. Now, the last thing Google wants is for me to own my profile. And quite frankly, the second last thing they want is for Facebook to steal my Google profile and so on and so forth. I mean, the whole reason why we do crypto and all the rest of this, Google's doing it to stop Facebook and Apple looking. It's nothing to do with me. They don't give a stuff about me. I don't matter. But, it's an advertising business. Right now, Google has 29% of the digital advertising revenue on the planet. And as we all know, that revenue is about 90% of the company's entire revenue. And it's, hitting up into the now billions of dollars. Their costs are tiny. All of the rivers of gold that used to be in newspaper publishing, including The Economist, all of it has been usurped by these people. And they are destroying huge swaths of traditional advertising revenue as they basically corral what they can corral and put to a bonfire everything else they can't control. So in the face of that, what does Web 3.0 offer? Do I have to pay for my searches? Do I have to pay for them? Do I have to pay for this stuff? Because now, believe it or not, it's free. It's free because I'm selling something I can't monetize individually. And so how much do I pay for a Google search? Nothing. But every time I type into that search bar, machines whir, money is spent. Some of the most awesome amounts of compute power on the planet get to work to deliver an answer within 40 milliseconds most of the time. Wow. And I don't pay a cent. Now, if you disintermediate that and pull all that apart, I get to pay $100 a search. Wow, that's going to go down well. And as a politician, that's going to go down well with the voters. It just isn't going to happen like that. And I think Web 3.0 is just bleating from the sidelines. It's kind of distracting. There is nothing of substance there. And in the same way that blockchain is just ephemeral hysteria, Web 3.0 is nothing more than ephemeral hysteria. It's merely a distraction. I could go on further, but I think you understand what I feel about it.
No, I've taken your point, and I think we all have. But Jeff, surely, and look, I might bring Asaki-san in here. I mean, surely there's some redeeming features here as part of these concepts. And I mean, Asaki-san, does a distributed, decentralized model of trust, does that mesh with your view of a future internet?
Yeah, I think most of the part has been covered by Jeff. Actually, when I carefully look at the history of the internet system, the first would be totally distributed based on the human trust, not the digital trust. Though that works, then we human beings try to get some technological way how to measure, how to evaluate the trust, which is basically came from the encryption technology, I may think. And also the first web Tim Berners-Lee provided is totally distributed, peer-to-peer system at all. Then the people start to realize that's the value created from the viewpoint of the advertisement or advertisement, right? Then the people start to make a trustable, reliable service with the client server, that the web server business. So that is again come to the trust of the service going to the money from the peer-to-peer investment for ourselves by ourselves model. That's a P2P model, I may think. So once upon a time, Google started to realize information looks like free. People love to give information against their searching service. Then they find out how to make money, as Jeff mentioned. Then it goes to the client server in order to firmly collect the data in order to make money. Right? Again, that's when went to the from the P2P to client server in order to get money from the users who used to be equally build the infrastructure. So now, I may think the Web 3.0, if that's going to be a conjunction with the blockchain is kind of PGP, pretty good privacy model. That going to more sophisticated technical solution would be blockchain. Once upon a time, they realized that would be possible to use as a money or trustable note. The trustable always the source of the money, I may think. So what they want to make such infrastructure by the help of the P2P technologies, I may think. So that's always the same behavior gonna happen. The difference would be where they get money. though the fundamental background is the trust and the quality of service. Once the Jeff enjoyed the technology, he solved the problem by himself or by herself with their own technology, right? Though if the people start to use the service, then the technology or businessman making the solution, then they asking something money. The money does not need to directly gain from the end user, but intermediate people be able to give money to them. So that is my understanding about Web.3. So the thing never be changed would be equality and trust. The who give the service to the end users. In other words, if the individual or end user has enough, a technological or knowledge about such a thing, then they could solve the problem by themselves.
Do you think, though, Asaki-san, and thank you for that answer, do you think, though, that like we have cryptocurrencies? The thing I find hard to reconcile here is that cryptocurrencies seem to be the forerunner to other services that will in future be built on blockchain. And the concept of cryptocurrencies and trust, I find really hard to reconcile. I mean, every week we see news stories about misuse and hacks and theft, and it does seem to be a bit like the Wild West. So, I mean, if these currencies are the most visible, these are the most visible part of what is supposed to be a new paradigm for the web, isn't that a bit concerning from a trust perspective? I'm happy to try
I think that came from the history of the money as well. Money was starting from just a number, digital numbers, right? Then the government or king is going to make a trust, putting on the currency or coin, though that is not the real value, right? That's the trust. So that is the nature of the money, I may think. So that's easily to introduce the digital currency or the digital coin, because money itself is just a digitized number. That's the origin of the money, I believe. So the thing is how provide that function. The function means some organization providing the trust or credibility, be able to exchange the number of the money to the other real product or real, objects. And then the object could be a chain of the objects, right? In this day, probably the money or stock or, the other physical object, you could exchange that. Then the people, making a, profit based on such a transaction, then the source of such a transaction is the trustability.
Yeah. Thank you, Asaki-san. Ken, I might bring you in here. I mean, what's going to make this a more trustable technology?
So I think this has been a very fruitful conversation. My reaction would be that trust is at its core, and part of that trust, as Asaki-san says, is expressed in money. But we can think of money not as money in like coins, but as some form of economic credit or some sort of value or worth. So another way of thinking about this would be, what if what we were trying to do was not have trust in terms of giving us an economic value, but giving us some sort of other sort of social value, say the integral value of the content, that it's actually legitimate, correct, and not and it's not been changed. Well, cryptography would do that as well, and we would use this system of the Web3 infrastructure to give us some sort of certainty on the integrity of the content and the material. And what we'd be getting from that would be getting the social worth of that trustless machine, that is the blockchain, but it wouldn't be actually minting a coin that we would then spend in a credit. We would just have these other forms of value. And that's the interesting thing. The attacks that you mentioned, Tony, in your question are ones that are sort of Web 1.0 attacks, right? To very classical cybersecurity issues on this infrastructure. And often the vulnerability is not in the Web 3 vulnerability of the blockchain. It's where the blockchain has met the Web 1, Web 2 classic cyber stuff of computing, which is the stuff of securing your network, having passwords that are not vulnerable, etc. The infrastructure itself of Web3 actually is quite robust, and the blockchain is robust. And we actually don't know yet how we're going to use it. We're in a period of intellectual ferment in which people are putting out ideas, and sometimes ideas that sound a little bit foolish, but I see that from Masaki-san and Jeff and I are all of a certain age where we remember in the 90s going to every single technological conference. And at every single conference, there was always some crazy guy who stood up. It was actually, often it was probably us, who stood up and said, in the future, devices are going to be talking to devices. There'll be more machines talking to machines than of people. And there was always one person who would say, well, what would we use it for? And say, well, your fridge would alert you when your milk goes off. So right now, if you look at your room, if you're in any room that you're in, or in any house, you will see a score, 20 different devices that are talking to each other. It might be a baby monitor, it might be a doorbell, etc. We still don't actually have a fridge that identifies if the milk is off and automatically orders it. We actually don't want that. That was sort of a useless thought experiment. It turns out it's probably wrong. But what wasn't wrong was that this infrastructure was going to be used, and we all have, maybe 15 digital devices. My watch is online. I can make a phone call with it and pay with it, etc. So we don't have to know exactly how we will use this infrastructure for us to believe that this infrastructure will be useful.
I think that's a good point. Jeff, is there anything you want to add on this? Because I actually want to pick up on something else you said before.
I'll say it, and I'll say it once. Trust is a market failure. Every single time we've tried to bring up high trust systems, we're unwilling to pay the price. We're unwilling to deploy DNSSEC. We're actually unwilling to impose on our own systems true trust. The true issue with most of the internet over the last 20 years has been scaling. And when I mean scaling, I really mean scaling. By factors of these days, 100 billion. How do you make a system grow by 10 to the 11th now? You replicate, you push it out to the edge. You cannot distribute unique artifacts. We are rebuilding the public library system where a copy of every book is just down the road. The whole reason why all of our conferences are now about data centers is that transit's irrelevant. We can't scale and do this. We can't afford to actually run distributed systems. If blockchain is really that much of a success, why is about 10% of the world's electricity generation being sent to solve meaningless, stupid puzzles to try and mine the next Bitcoin? This is collective mass hysteria and insanity. This is completely bonkers. The real problem, as we all know, is that the silicon industry are cowboys. These guys think nothing about building 10 billion processors every year. That's the basic target. The stretch targets are frightening. How do you build a networking system to cope? Now, that's been the question for the last 20 years. And the only way we can answer that is reduce the radius of the Earth, squash things down, make the server close to the client. How do we do that? Take the massive abundance of computing and storage, and that's massively abundant, and bring copies close to users, your local library or the equivalent. And that's been the engineering of the internet. Where does trust sit in all that? Near. It's an optional extra that nobody, literally nobody, is willing to pay for. And do you know what we do when we have that problem? We say to governments, hey, it's your problem. The market isn't going to solve this. Set up some shiny cybersecurity wadi-bar and say good things about security and trust, because out there in the market space, it's not being solved because there's no money in it. So part of this is we solve the big problems, and it's really scaling, and everything else gets shunted to the side. And that's been the last 20 years, and it's going to be the next 10, easy peasy, because scaling is everything. Nothing else matters.
Yeah,
That's
I
my
definitely
view.
agree with Jeff. The scalability is the most important, key to making a continuous service to the end user. I mean, the why I use the trust is well, in order to make a trustable service, as you, Jeff, mentioned, the scalability is a key in order to keep the interest and the use of the service by the users. So by my word, that would be trust. So trust could be built by, many ways. Once that went to the client server model, it went to the economical success probably. That's going to be impossible to scale infinity. So a different architecture came from the P2P based on the individual. That's what I want to say. Then the trust would be going to the peer-to-peer individual capabilities, be able to, adaptively, flexibly, adapt to the change of the environment.
So if we had a blockchain adherent here, the first thing they would say, if we had a very wise and open-minded blockchain adherent, the first thing they might do is they might agree with Jeff and say, yeah, there's Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and that does look a little bit like tulips, from the Dutch tulip craze in the 1600s. Let's leave that aside, right? When will that market crash, and what does it mean to crash? It's a separate question. But blockchain technology is interesting, and they might even agree with Esaki-san and Jeff Houston and turn the tables and say, actually, you guys scaled the internet technically. What we're doing is we're scaling the governance. And you might say that if you really looked at the technical design of the blockchain, so we went from one centralized entity who made all the decisions to 13 super nodes that do mathematical calculations. Spot the difference. 13 doesn't look very different than 1. But it's not such a bad outcome, because you actually do fracture governance and you do distribute the sort of power to some degree, in the same way that you used to have a monarchy, and now you've got 3 branches of government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. And you might say there's a 3 versus 1, but that 3 versus 1 is huge, right? That's huge when it comes to political governance. Now we actually are able to change the technical governance. And these people, and then we get all these little features on the side where we don't have to trust each other, but we do need a majority. And a majority is better than having to sort of get the divine right of kings, John Postel and Ayana. Although I think a lot of us maybe harken back to those days and kind of wish they came back. But nevertheless, be it as it may, it's about scaling the governance, which I think people find very, very interesting. And we can look beyond technology and think about where this could be really, really interesting. The obvious sort of things are like property titles, land deeds, et cetera. Putting things on the blockchain would be very good. In the community of fine-stringed instruments, where you need to accredit and give the provenance of every Stradivarius and also know what work has been done on the instrument, so another maker or a purchaser can actually see what's happened. The blockchain seems to be really interesting in terms of how you can actually have this sort of register that is decentralized and there's one singleized home for it. Wikipedia would be a good example if you could imagine putting it on the blockchain and giving some sort of certainty that the content that you're getting is authentic. Would be really sort of valuable. So we're at an early days right now, but I think the imagination can be stretched into how this can be beneficial.
Yeah, I think when I carefully look at the blockchain at the very beginning, it looks as very, very good. Though that has the dark side. I think on the brighter side, important thing how to manage or how to govern how to apply or develop the technology to the real world system. In this state, in order to get money based on the blockchain, you need huge investment into the computers, data centers, and power, right? So once some country limited the blockchain, then the neighbor country has a crisis in the power supply. That's my understanding. Then the blockchain, the key person who need huge electricity. That is no more, end-to-end technology system at all. Of course, the initial design was purely peer-to-peer. Though how to deploy those systems is the important thing from the viewpoint of the double edge. Always have the dark side and brighter side.
Ken, I have to worry about what you just said from a societal viewpoint. For the last couple of millennia, we've relied on selective amnesia. We forget things. I do something wrong. I get hit across the knuckles. Naughty Jeff, don't do that again. 20 years later, everyone's forgotten. But now we're breeding a bunch of kids whose excesses on Facebook last year are immutable. And if they're in a blockchain, they're unerasable. Once our record keepers are computers that have effectively the memory is inbuilt in that chain, you cannot change it at all. A society that used to believe in redemption, that used to believe that you can do better, that used to believe that, yes, we forget stuff and that's okay, is now in a society that says every misdeed is eternal. Every sin is irrevocable. And this strikes me. I'm old enough to think that's a terrible society. It's not a place built for humans. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a very deep concern there, as big as a concern as Google holding 92% of the share market in search. We start to give away some of our fundamental tenets of how we build our society to this temple of technology and say, well, this is great. It's not. And those aspects of this would have to concern anyone who thinks deeply about our society. Now, that's way beyond the governance of the internet. And in fact, I think the governance of the internet these days is a misnomer. Quite frankly, when we deregulated this industry, we took what now is another irrevocable step. Everything is market forces. Governments kid themselves that their regulatory measures like GDPR sound great, but are useless. That most of their responses to what's going on in the market are nonsensical, completely ineffectual. The showdown between the Australian government and Facebook and Google over advertising revenue, prompted largely by Rupert Murdoch, as far as one can tell, was really an eloquent expression of failure on the part of government. Complete, abject, total failure.
Okay.
So it's a market now, and it's a market that just has its own rules and it's out of control, but that's what it is.
Before you interject, Kenneth, and I do want to hear your feedback here. I just want to give a quick note to the audience. We are going to start opening up for your questions shortly as well, and our panelists obviously are really getting into it here. But if you have a question in the audience, please do either ask it by typing it into the chat box, or raise your hand, and we can allow you to ask that question. But I'll let you keep going. Jeff, you ventured into the spiritual there for a moment when you were saying about the blockchain was against a world of redemption, and I almost fell off my chair. But please, Ken, continue.
So we're still in early days, and I have when hearing Jeff rail against his creation of creating at least the transport layer of it, it seemed, and how we're going to be lost to sort of the wiles of the ocean, the open ocean where law doesn't apply. I can't help but sort of have my mind think back and see through Jeff and what he's wearing today into this swashbuckling sailor in the 1500s with his leather boots tied up to his knee and maybe an eye patch and a bandana, and a parrot on his side. Not that he's a pirate per se, but that he's just a swashbuckling marine merchant going off on his seas. And what he's telling us is that when you're on the high seas, there's no law, right? When you're out on the high seas and you can see that there's a ship there, anything goes. You're on your own, right? It's this space where the sovereign and the monarch doesn't exist. And there was a period of time when that was indeed the case. But what happens with technologies is that after this period of ferment and experimentation, as it goes hither thither, the law, structure, self-imposed governance and norms, that is simply, and culture does fit into it, and suddenly we mold it to our needs and our values. Now, sometimes our values might only be mercantile and commercial, and so it distorts things and goes in one direction, not another. But when it comes to technology, the whole debate that's been taking place for the last decade has been the backlash against large technology companies. And empires have sprung up directly related to addressing the concerns that Jeff has put forward. So if you recall, Snapchat as a social network has popped up, and their defining feature is that the content disappears, not that it's saved forever. So in other words, we can design the technical underpinnings of how we want the content or the information governed through our decisions. And I think that is indeed what's going to happen. So although I actually completely agree with Jeff that we've designed a system that has an impermanence to the information, and that we have our social mores and norms that become very unforgiving of people, and this is a real clash. I think where things are going to evolve is a new media literacy and a new technical design that tries to shimmy away information after it's been sort of quote unquote out of date, and a huge forgiveness on the part of the 18-year-olds today who are going to be the 45-year-olds tomorrow, that they're going to say, yeah, well, of course that was just a youthful indiscretion and we can't hold that person to account, as we used to do in the 2020s when someone would be appointed editor of a publication, but then it would be yanked from her before she could actually serve because of tweets that she had written a decade earlier. It's not going to be perfect, but I do hold out hope that in fact, that is I shouldn't say hold out hope. I see that is the direction that things are going. And again, it'll never be perfect.
There's a couple of points I just want to jump in here that we touched on a couple of times here across speakers, and that is the tech titans, I guess, and how they have perhaps built empires. I mean, is this, the drums have been beating for regulation of the large internet companies for many years now, and it seems that this appears to be, when do we reach the tipping point? When do governments really, I guess, seriously put their mind to this, or is regulation the answer? I mean, are there other ways to I guess to make an impact on the dominance of some of the large internet players?
So the poor old EU. Sorry.
Well, that's the interesting point. I always think about what is the government? What was the government? I think the government is continue to build top on the soil, spatial limitation. Once people goes to the outside the soil, then the different regulation gonna apply. That was government, right? The digitalization remove or disappear the limitation of such physical or spatial limitation about the business or human being and activities. Therefore, the object can be live on the cyber domain. That's independent from the spatial domain. That's how the the hyper giants now living, or the other company already living. Though the regulation itself may ask where is the headquarters in order to pay tax. That is meaningless at all in this state. That is the real meaning of digitalization. the total, unlimitation or unbundling from the spatial limitation that I always call about IoT to IOF. Things are connected. It was government countries, federated physical system. So once upon a time, the people started to realize things, be able to define in the cyber domain as a function. Then the function be able to travel around all over the globe, even for the universe or space. Then the total, definition of the government must be changed based on the digitization. So that's basically, I always think about then the country or government must to realize such a situation, then how to live with such a, organization or institution who living on the cyber domain.
The Peace of Westphalia, it wasn't the peace, it was the Peace of Westphalia, 1638, that actually established geographic territories for nation states who exercised a monopoly of violence within those borders. And we've lived that life ever since all around the world, absolutely. And oddly enough, when we talk about these digital giants, there are two conversations. And it depends on where you live, what the conversation is. Because in the EU, for example, the fact that up to 25% of their citizens use the DNS services provided by an American company with no contract, no agreement, no assurance, nothing, breeds a certain level of, would I say, Westphalian nervousness. Because when things turn rough and it becomes glaring at the Americans going, we're not friends anymore, all of your digital infrastructure is destroyed because the DNS these days, the DNS is the only clue left to build the internet. We blew up addresses years ago. They don't count. Naming counts. And these days, 30% of the world's internet users, 30%, have their queries answered by an American company. So outside America, this is not about digital giants as much as US hegemony. And it's a deeply unsettling discussion because in some ways, nation states who used to have this sovereign border are now incredibly vulnerable and dependent on the actions of entities over which they have no control, no understanding, no treaty. And from the US point of view, I am an alien. My data has no rights. There is no protection. And me and the other, 7 billion others all have our data there, but have no rights. That's a deeply unsettling problem. In the US, it's a different conversation. And oddly enough, the conversation is about the giants, full stop. And it's an old conversation that goes back to the Sherman Act. It's all about is big bad or is what big does that's bad? Is it your behavior or the mere fact you're big? Well rehearsed, and it's an age-old conversation, and we know about it. And the failure of the US to actually do anything, even AT&T's deregulation was a failure, stays that inside the US, that conversation is terminally broken. Outside the US, it's a different conversation, but it's terminally broken for a different set of reasons. And so if that doesn't make you feel, oh my God, this is horrible, I haven't done my job right.
I'm just going to jump in here because we have a question from the audience, and it's from Paul Wilson. He says that the Bitcoin was designed to run on infrastructure that we can't trust. Yet ISOC seeks an internet that we can trust. So can we have it, or are we asking for something we actually won't want when we get it? Who would like to answer that one?
Well, as a head of the board of the trustee, when we make such a trustable internet activities by ISOC, the meaning of trust is how to make an intrustable behavior in the internet, or how to make a very resilient infrastructure operation, like a routing or authentication thing, that is for the person who want to have the more reliable communication over the global internet. So that is in order to people, for comfortably use the internet, we have to have some level of, comfortable or trustable operation, not 100% correctability or reliability. Very, reliable, very comfortable and reasonable operational quality. That's my understanding of the trust when we talk about it.
So is it a sign of reliability and trust when a ransomware attack brings down the operator of a domestic US pipeline and causes massive queues at service stations for over 5 days, all because of a failure in the basic model of what we're doing digitally? And it seems that while we talk about this a lot, our failures to actually bring up resilience and trust put these tombstones, these markers of the fact that the more we push digital infrastructure out there, the more it has edges that we just don't understand well. And telling people to trust us, we know what we're doing, seems to ring hollow if you're sitting in a line for petrol for 5 hours. It's kind of, I'm sorry, someone's done something wrong here and I'm the victim. How did this happen? And so it's hard to understand how we've made a success of trust when we're just so vulnerable in almost everything we do digitally. This has not been a success story. And I go back to my original statement, like it or not, trust has been a market failure. We haven't put our operators, our operations, our applications to the grindstone of saying, spend the extra money. I want it cheap. I want it produced by tomorrow. I want it sold by Amazon the day after. And I don't care if it's, rubbish, digitally speaking. I don't care if the security model is, looks good. Sell it and let the customer beware. This is terrible.
But is this where regulation comes in? What are your thoughts on the regulation of tech businesses here to produce, I guess, not only secure and safe items, but just in general?
Yeah, so this is a very productive conversation. Let's remember that there's lots of market failures. In fact, a cynic would actually say everything is market failure until we actually fix it, and then it's not a market failure anymore, and then we don't actually see it. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. A market failure in the past was how fire departments used to work. This is now about 400, 500 years ago in economic history, at the birth of fire departments, in which you'd have a plaque out in your house, sort of nailed in, that identified which department, which fire company would service your house. And if there was you can imagine a row of houses in London, and there was, different private fire departments, that, one house would be burning, and then the house in the middle would belong to a different department. And then likewise. And so the firemen would come and they'd put out one house, but they would leave the other one to burn, which made no sense. And maybe the other house next to it, adjoining, was another company, was with another company, or didn't have it. And so they would have to wait until that one started burning before they put it out, but they couldn't put out the one that was between the two houses. Okay. It made absolutely no sense. So the first thing that happened was we actually took what was part of the private sector and turned it into a state activity where the government would do that. And it was part of a public good to have a fire department. But the second thing that we did, because there was still market failures there, was we introduced insurance. And insurance companies have lots of carve-outs in terms of regulatory compliance and interactions. In some instances, by law, people are obligated to buy insurance. Every driver needs to have insurance. In America, it's healthcare. It's a privatized system. Likewise, we have the insurance for the purpose of fusing a marketplace incentive to act and have certain behaviors that would be socially good. So for example, you can't insure a vehicle unless it has a seatbelt and unless it has certain other sort of safety conditions. So we can imagine applying this sort of approach to having rules in which, say, every business over a certain size must carry cybersecurity insurance. And in this case, for Jeff's example, what you would have, and again, this is just imperfect, but it would actually raise the game for everyone, as an eligibility of coverage, you would have to comply with certain requirements, maybe DNSSEC would be imposed. And then you maybe have to have an internal review with it, like an auditor, just as we have for financial books. We would have an internal cybersecurity auditor who does it on an annual basis, identifying clear vulnerabilities. You haven't upgraded your Microsoft server, etc., and to say this is what you need to do, and then you do that. And it doesn't actually fix the problem, right? We still have fires, we still have car crashes that are terrible. But the point is, it will actually raise the baseline to a higher degree, and we'll have a better system-wide. But what does it take to do that? It requires a state, right? It requires a sovereign. David Hume pointed out that because our lives are finite and of a span of 80 years or so, he didn't say 80 at the time, but it was finite and short, that we don't think long term. So we need to go to the state as the institution that will take on long-term projects that individual businesses and people wouldn't take on themselves. And we have seen an erosion of the power of the state, the valuable part of the state. And I think, interestingly, a countervailing force is emerging in which we are going to hearken back to that, trying to find different ways in which we can use governmental power to solve our very human needs.
Thank you, Ken. I mean, out of that, I mean, do we see, I guess, these big, large companies and regulation and how we solve these problems? I mean, do we see that that this situation to continue of having large, I guess, players in our internet dominating? Is that a good thing for us to continue to have if they play by the rules, or is greater, I guess, innovation and new contestants in this market something that we want to encourage from our society and from government regulation to aim towards that?
Before I let the others weigh in, because I know everyone wants to, let me just answer that. Having large behemoths solves part of the problem, right? Because if you really cared about network security, and you have Microsoft and you have Google and you have Facebook, Google running Gmail is just one example. You really like these large centralized entities because you basically tell one entity to fix the problem, and now 60% of people have their problem solved, right? And you don't get that gain if it's a purely disaggregated system. The second thing I want to say, just to throw in, is that if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, we'd probably be talking about AT&T and BT and France Telecom. And if we were having it, and Microsoft, I should add, and if we were talking about it 10 years earlier still, or 20 years earlier still, we'd be talking about IBM and the Seven Sisters, right? And Data Control Corp, Digital Equipment Corp, rather. So the point is that technology has always had these large monolithic players that we all want to hate. This is the new era today, and I think it'll be a combination of market forces as well as regulation that tamps down on it.
I offer you this in response, and it's a very quick observation. We wouldn't have HTTPS and TLS 1.3 were it not for Google and Chrome. If they didn't stamp their massive feet and reverberate around the world that if you're not doing channel encryption on the web, we're going to start blocking you in the world's browser used by 80% of users. That's why we have it. The behemoth said yes. DNSSEC, imperfect and poorly actually implemented as it is only there because Google's 888 service did it. If they didn't do it, it wouldn't have been anywhere. And so I agree with Ken that you need a certain size to push the market into directions that it wouldn't naturally follow otherwise. And of course, the weird thing about most of this stuff is that this is this classic failure model. Clients actually want better service. They actually want this. And if you will, servers would like to do it. But in both cases, the ability to get over that threshold of doing it was high enough that only the very largest could make the necessary initiatives and moves to get everyone else following. Let's Encrypt only appeared after Google, not before. Before, security was an unaffordable luxury. Trust was only there if you're incredibly rich. Now trust is everywhere because of them. And so it's true, and I agree with the IBM and the developments in AT&T, that a lot of this comes from these very large corporations, which have actually the ability to do things that smaller, undercapitalized entities simply could not do in limited markets. And it's that trade-off of balance. Yes, it's easy to despise. I think it's the current acronym is MAMA, isn't it? MAMA, something like that. Who cares? It's certainly fashionable to despise it, but at the same time, I don't think we really appreciate that if we didn't have that central mass and that pressure placed on everyone else, we'll be going, we're going backwards in some ways, trying to amass the necessary momentum to do it. And so there is this creative tension going on. Is regulation the answer? Well, quite frankly, it's had its successes and failures. Honestly, I'd hate to be in government. I'd certainly hate to be in the EU right now, trying to figure out how to react to this stuff. It is a conundrum. It seems that almost any reaction, direct intervention, regulation, has phenomenal downsides. So I'm not sure I know what the answer is. I don't think I do.
I'm just going to jump in here because we only have 4 minutes remaining, and we have one final question. So, and Asaki-san, I'll let you go first. You've been waiting.
Short reaction against the regulation thing. Since I'm working with the Japanese government, some level, the regulation help somehow, some way. The major part is the function is just providing alternative and freedom for the people who are not giant. Once someone find the best service, we must provide them how to, improve their service, how to, build up the business. That is the how the government going to help the beautiful alternative. Of course, that would be free freedom or competitive or fair condition. Though that is only thing the government should have the regulation to help new opportunity to new players.
Thank you.
Naturally, the industry gonna accept those new things.
We have one final question and only a few minutes to answer, but I think it actually is probably a good one to summarize after all the things we've talked about. So Maz is asking us, we have been adapting our network design to the changing use of the internet over the years and trust models, blockchain, Web3, etc. Are the things that we've talked about today, how are these going to impact future network design? If anyone wants to hazard an answer on that, how do you see this actually impacting network design, or will it not? At the end of the day, the network equipment is still carrying it's still carrying data. Is there a change that you see, Jeff?
Tension is now vertical, not horizontal. It used to be a tension between different ways of doing networking, between different vendors, between different technologies. We were discussing TCP versus OSI versus this versus that. These days, if you actually look at the most dramatic area of tension, it's between the application and the infrastructure. The application folk are sick and tired of waiting for the infrastructure to get better, waiting for this new DNS features to be deployed in all these DNS boxes, waiting for better transport to be deployed inside sort of the boxes that we run. And so the folk who do applications have said, don't want to wait, don't want to pay for it. As long as the infrastructure can handle a tunneled, connection, I'm going to ignore this seething, toxic, glows in the dark wasteland called the internet and its network. I'm going to tunnel through it and go to places I trust as an application. And so what we're seeing now is a commoditization of the network, where decreasingly it has value inherently. It doesn't. The only bits that's public now is that last mile between the user on their mobile device and the data center. And all the rest of that infrastructure has been privatized and moved out of the public space because the public space turned toxic. And that's a real bad sign. If you're working in the public space in networking, the industry doesn't value it anymore. They're sick and tired of how bad it is. And applications are now going, look, I can do this better without relying on any support from the stack. They just don't. And that's almost the bad news here, that the application folk have all the money. Those giants aren't networking giants, they're application giants. And they're actually innovating inside their own economy and marginalizing all the rest of the platform. Who builds submarine cables? Google. Is it public? No, it's private. You know, all of that infrastructure is now being privatized and is no longer available for open abuse. It just isn't. It's been taken off that table. And that's sort of a weird outcome, but it's the outcome we're living in.
Thank you, Jeff. Look, we've reached our time here, and a session poll will come up shortly for you for those of you watching to rate our session today. But I just wanted to say thank you very much to our panel, to you, Ken, for joining us at short notice, for coming so early in the morning. We really appreciate it. To Asaki-san, thank you so much. We know you're a very busy man, and we appreciate your time. And Jeff, obviously, of course, we always value your inputs. And look, a lot of the discussion today, we talked about, I guess, empires growing and falling and in the internet, and it reminded me of the opening lines of the very famous Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, where it says, "The empire long divided must unite, but long united it must divide." And it's always been this way, and it kind of feels that way right now when we're talking about Web3 and other things as well. The book was written thousands of years ago, yet it still feels very, very pertinent to what we're talking about today. But thank you all so much for your attendance, and I hope that everybody watching has enjoyed this session. It's been very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. See you soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
No more recording. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Hiroshi. Look, it's been amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was
And I have to
fantastic.
say, I am still a fanboy of The Economist. I'm like, if I read anything every week, it's The Economist. It's the only place where I actually get decent analysis.
Yeah, I also love the economy. I
You
love
guys
money
are doing the world's best job there in this technology debate. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you very
Bye now.
much. Thank you.